In this video you will learn how you can win very easily with the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez. After the moves e4, e5. White can play knight f3, developing his king's knight and threatening to capture the e5 pawn. Black can reply knight c6, developing his queen's knight and defending the e5 pawn. Now, white can play bishop b5, entering the Spanish opening, aka Ruy Lopez. Black can play a6, immediately attacking the enemy bishop, with the idea of driving it out. Now, white can capture the knight, entering the exchange variation. Black can recapture in two ways. Capturing with the knight pawn is an inaccuracy, since after b takes c6, white can play d4 increasing the pressure against the e5 pawn. After e takes d4. White plays queen takes d4. Black's pawn structure has been weakened and white has the advantage. After bishop takes c6, the correct move for black is d takes c6, capturing with the queen pawn to keep his pawns together on the queen side. Now, it is a mistake to capture the e5 pawn, since after knight takes e5. Black plays queen d4, attacking the knight and the e4 pawn. After knight f3. Black plays queen takes e4 check. After queen e2, queen takes e2 check. King takes e2. Black has the advantage, because he keeps the bishop pair and white does not have a pawn majority on the king side to compensate. After the move d takes c6, white can play in several ways. For example, Bobby Fischer now castled, with the idea of then playing d4 and occupying the center with his pawns. However, simpler and more forcing is d4, which is the move Lasker used to play. Now, black basically has two options. For example, he can play bishop g4, developing the queen's bishop and pinning the white knight. White can play d takes e5, capturing the opponent's pawn. Black can exchange queens. After king takes d1. Black can castle on the long side with check. After king e2. Black can play rook e8, with the idea of capturing the e5 pawn. White can play h3, attacking the enemy bishop. After bishop takes f3. King takes f3. Black captures the e5 pawn. White can play bishop f4, developing the bishop and attacking the opponent's rook. After rook e6. White can play knight d2, completing the development of his minor pieces and has very good play. White retains a majority of pawns on the king side and has very good chances to play for the win. After the move d4, the best option for black is to capture the pawn with e takes d4. White plays queen takes d4. Black can exchange queens and white plays knight takes d4. The queens have been exchanged and the position has been simplified. From here on, the winning plan for white is to exchange all pieces and reach a victorious pawn endgame. If you look at the pawn structure you can see that white has a pawn majority on the king side, which is a useful majority, as white will be able to create a passed pawn on the king side. Whereas black's pawn majority on the queen side is useless, as one of his pawns is doubled and therefore black will not be able to create a passed pawn on the queen side. That is, the pawn endgame is easily won for white. From this position we are going to follow a masterful game so that you can see how the game can go and the plans for both sides. Now, black played bishop d7, developing the queen's bishop and preparing to castle on the queen side. White played bishop e3, developing the queen's bishop and reinforcing the defense of the knight on d4. Black castled long. White played knight d2, completing the development of his minor pieces and preparing to castle either side. Black played bishop d6, developing his king's bishop. White castled long. Black played rook e8, repositioning the rook, with the idea of putting pressure on the e4 pawn. White played knight b3, with the idea of bringing the knight to c5, which will be an excellent post in the enemy camp, from where it will attack the bishop on d7 and put pressure on the queen side. If black now plays b6, with the idea of limiting the mobility of the opponent's knight, white can play a4, with the idea of advancing with a5 and creating weaknesses on the opponent's queen side. After a5, to stop the advance of the white pawn, white can play knight c4, activating the other knight and threatening to capture on d6. Black can play bishop f8 to keep alive the bishop pair. White can play knight b to d2, defending the e4 pawn, which was attacked, and allowing the move b3, to reinforce the defense of the a4 pawn. White has good play. In the game, after the move knight b3, black played f5, attacking the opponent's central pawn, with the idea of opening the game to activate his bishops. White played knight c4, activating the knight and threatening to capture on d6. Black played bishop f8 to keep the bishop pair. White captured on f5. After bishop takes f5. White played bishop c5, with the idea of exchanging a pair of bishops and taking away the opponent's bishop pair. White wants to exchange pieces to reach a winning pawn endgame. The game continued knight f6, developing the knight. White played rook h to e1, bringing his king's rook into play and threatening to capture the opponent's rook. If now, black exchanges rooks, white can play rook takes e1. After bishop takes c5, knight takes c5. If black plays knight g4, attacking on the king side, white simply plays f3 and the black knight has to retreat. Since knight takes h2 is not possible, because white plays rook h1. The black knight is trapped and white wins. In the game, after the move rook to e1, black played bishop e6, blocking the e-file and threatening to capture the undefended knight on c4. White played knight e5, defending his knight and placing it on a good square in the center. Black played bishop takes b3, eliminating the enemy knight and leaving the bishop on c5 without support. White played bishop takes f8. If black now plays bishop takes c2, white plays bishop takes g7 and wins. Since after bishop takes d1, white plays bishop takes h8, with a great advantage. In the game, after the move bishop takes f8, black played rook h takes f8. White played a takes b3. White's pawns have been doubled on the queen side, but this is not important. The important factor is that pieces are being exchanged, the position is being simplified and white retains a majority of pawns on the king side, which will allow him to create a passed pawn in that area. Now, black played knight d5, centralizing the knight and freeing up the action for his rook to try to capture the f2 pawn. White played knight d3, defending the f2 pawn and freeing up the action for the rook along the e-file, with the idea of continuing to exchange pieces. As we have already said, white's plan is simple: exchange all the pieces to lead the game towards a winning pawn endgame. The game continued a5, trying to create counterplay on the queen side. White played rook takes e8 check, exchanging a pair of rooks. After rook takes e8, white played king d2, with the idea of activating the king for the endgame. Black played rook d8 aiming against the enemy king. White played king e2, with the idea of moving the king closer to the king side to support the advance of his pawns in that area. Black played b6. White played f4, starting to advance with his pawn majority on the king side. Black played c5, continuing to advance his pawns on the queen side, to try to obtain counterplay. White played g3, reinforcing the defense of the f4 pawn, in order to be able to move his knight. Black played rook e8 check. White played king f3. Now, it would be useless to play rook e3 check, because after king f2, white threatened c4, which would force the black rook to retreat. In the game, black played knight f6, with the idea of preventing the white king from advancing further. White played knight e5, centralizing the knight and freeing up the action for the rook. The black king cannot move closer to the kingside and white is now ready to advance his kingside pawns and create a passed pawn. Black played king b7, trying to activate his king. White played g4, continuing the advance of his kingside pawns. Now, black played h5, trying to break the enemy pawn's attack front. White played g5 and the black knight is attacked. If now black plays knight g8, white plays knight g6, taking control of the e7 square to prevent the black knight from being activated. For example, it is not possible knight e7, to try to reactivate the knight, because white plays rook e1, pinning the black knight and white wins. In the game, black played knight g4, threatening to capture on e5 and h2. White played knight takes g4. After h takes g4 check. King takes g4. White has won a pawn. Black played rook e2, invading with the rook on the second rank to try to create counterplay. White played king f5, advancing his king with the idea of going to capture the pawn on g7. Black played rook takes h2, capturing a pawn and restoring the material balance. White played king g6, threatening to capture the g7 pawn. White is going to get a passed pawn on the kingside and has a decisive advantage. The game continued. Rook takes c2. And now white, before capturing the g7 pawn, played first the move rook f1, placing his rook behind the f-pawn. Black played rook takes b2, capturing another pawn. But white played king takes g7 and black finally resigned, since the f-pawn is unstoppable, and white wins easily. A very instructive game in which we have seen how white won with a very simple plan using the exchange variation of the Ruy Lopez.